Imagine, demand, and build a world transformed.
And welcome to today's session about mutual aid. So we've got 3 speakers who will speak for the first kind of half of the session. And then we'll go into questions, have a little break, and come back and do the more interactive, participatory part of the session. But everyone's going to be assigned to a breakout room and you can all talk to each other. So yeah, should be a good way of sharing our experiences and collating knowledge. Because it is participatory, there's a couple of rules of engagement I need to read out from TWT. I'm sure you're all going to be really nice to each other, but it's good to have some ground rules. So whether online or in physical spaces, TWT is about creating an environment where people can learn and debate with each other in a spirit of kindness and respect. There are a few rules of engagement here. The first is an assumption of goodwill, even if someone is saying something you disagree with. Assume they're doing so with the best interests of the movement at heart and disagree with kindness and respect. Listen more than you talk. Be aware of how much you're talking and make sure that others can speak as well. Call out bigotry. It's a pluralist space and in which we encourage comradely debate, but bigotry will be challenged. And be kind to your facilitators. We've got 4 amazing facilitators on today, and they're all volunteers giving up their time. So be kind to them and help them out. And finally, there's a supporter network. The World Transformed relies on your support to continue the work this month and all year round. 94 people have signed up to the supporters network since the beginning of the festival. We need 60 more monthly supporters to reach our target and fund all the projects that we want to do. If you can spare a small monthly donation, please consider supporting us at theworldtransformed.org/support. Right, so we've got 3 speakers, and in the order in which they'll speak, they are Anna Vickerstaff, Louise Delmege, and Juno Mac. I have little bios here, but I think because I've been going on already, it'd be nice for them to introduce themselves, maybe. Do you want to do that in turn? Anna, can we have you first if you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hiya, my name is Anna, and I was one of a small group of people that helped to set up the COVID Mutual Aid UK website, which I can explain a little bit more about what that means when I talk in a second. But yeah, nice to be here.
And Louise, can we have you on?
Hi, I'm Louise. I'm a national organiser of National Food Service, and I'm a director of National Food Service Bristol. And throughout lockdown, we've been doing emergency food delivery. And
finally, Juno.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me. I'm a sex worker organizer with SWARM, the Sex Worker Advocacy and Resistance Movement. And I'm also one of the volunteers on the SWARM Hardship Fund, which we set up at the start of the pandemic to raise money and distribute funds directly to sex workers whose income was impacted. And I'll be talking more about that today.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here. And yeah, so Anna, do you want to start off?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So yeah, just to kind of introduce who I am a little bit more, because it's always nice to know who you're listening to. My name is Anna, and I have a history of grassroots organising, mostly on climate and migrants' rights. Spent a lot of time in the anti-fracking fight over the last few years, and I work at a climate NGO for my day job now. Yeah, I also was born in the Midlands, grew up in Yorkshire, and now live in South London, so have a very confused accent, so apologies about that. Depends on what mood I'm in and how tired I am, how my voice comes out, so if it changes halfway through, it's probably because I'm feeling nervous or stressed or excited, so please forgive the confusion there. And yeah, in terms of my place on this call and why I'm here to talk to you, as I said, I was part of a small group of friends and volunteers who set up the COVID Mutual Aid UK website at the start of lockdown. We initially were in a group in Lewisham, like a Facebook group, where we wanted to look at the principles of mutual aid to do some community support in our area, and then basically created a Google Doc to see if other groups wanted to copy the format, which we put on a website, and it sort of spiraled in a way that I had not anticipated that happening. But it's worth saying that I think something that I feel really like I really need to clarify in terms of who I am and what COVID Mutual Aid UK was and is I think for a lot of people, lockdown was a lot of people's first experience of the concept of mutual aid, and it was something that lots of people hadn't necessarily thought about before or heard of. And there was a really unhelpful narrative in the media that the group I was in had sort of invented the idea of mutual aid, which is completely outrageous as a concept. And like mutual aid, I'm not going to go into the history of mutual aid, but mutual aid has a really strong radical history in Black working class spaces, and especially in communities that exist outside the traditional economy. So migrants and sex workers especially using mutual aid to support communities that are structurally disconnected from the state, basically. So yeah, there was a really unhelpful kind of narrative that a group of shiny young white people from Lewisham had invented this concept of mutual aid, which is definitely not true, and something that I think it's really important to look at where the concept of mutual aid and history of mutual aid has come from, and both in terms of what have been successes in learning from that through the pandemic, and also what the challenges have been in terms of a whole wave of new people engaging with the concept of mutual aid and what that's done to sort of undo some of the principles of mutual aid. So I'm going to try and touch on that a little bit in the next few minutes, if that sounds all right with you. Yeah, so in terms of, as I said, we started as a group of friends in Lewisham, existed on a Facebook group, friends who had a bit more of an understanding of what mutual aid was through reading or practice. And then, as I said, we set up this website and I guess Google Doc, for want of there's not a fancy way of describing it, it was just a Google Doc with a bit of a structure of how our group had set up, how we were communicating, and some rough principles of how other groups could replicate it. At the same time, so I was saying there was obviously already lots of mutual aid groups with decades of history that already exist around the country. But there were also other new groups springing up at the same time with similar ideas. So this wasn't the first mutual aid group or even the flagship mutual aid group in the UK, but it was one where suddenly we had some kind of centralised resources for other groups to copy. And what that was intended to look like was a space where we would create a place for groups to list themselves, so that people looking for their nearest mutual aid group could put their postcode in and find a mutual aid group nearest them where they could access it through usually a WhatsApp group or a Facebook group, which in itself is limited in terms of accessibility, so that's not ideal, but that's how a lot of the groups were self-organising. And then also creating a Facebook group where admins of those mutual aid groups were able to share resources and information with each other, do a bit of peer-to-peer support, and also try and find a space to put resources that campaign groups or organisations were putting together on best practice, both in terms of safeguarding during a pandemic, but also in terms of how to distribute food safely, and trying to centralise those a little bit on the website, which included resources from where Louise is from, but also from organisations like Queer Care. Some migrant rights organisations put some resources together on how best to support migrants during the pandemic through mutual aid, and we tried to list those on the website. By the middle of lockdown, there were I think 2 million people that were part of these mutual aid groups, and there were 4,000 or so listed on the map. And within those mutual aid groups, a lot of them had broken down into further groups that were split by street. And actually, I think the most effective organising that we have seen in mutual aid groups during the pandemic has either been ones that are very small and working kind of street by street and able to provide that support in that way, or where they're mutual aid groups that are built around specific communities and therefore understand the needs of specific demographics. So, for example, mutual aid groups that are specifically looking at migrants supporting other migrants, or young queer people supporting other young queer people, etc. So that's where it seemed to be the most successful organising from my perspective. I think it's worth saying that the scale in which the groups grew on this map and the expectation of centralised support from us was not something we were expecting. And I think that there were some huge successes with that and also some failures that sort of go hand in hand that I'm just going to talk through a little bit now. And yeah, I definitely have some criticisms of the way the organising was done and things we can learn, but that's not in any way to undo what was an unbelievable swell in genuine good intention and willingness of people to support each other, and the number of acts that took place and are still taking place in mutual aid groups as a result of these new groups springing up over lockdown shouldn't be sniffed at. It's a real genuine labour of love that has created a genuine sense of community in lots of spaces where I feel like personally I haven't experienced it to the same level before, and that's really amazing. But I think it's also worth saying that the successes aren't down to any specific organisation or structure, and that those successes are a result of something catalysing what is inherent kindness in people. And I think there's a lot of divisiveness in our media and in our politics that often lead us to think of people as fundamentally selfish, and capitalism doesn't help with that either, right? But I think that what we've seen during the pandemic is that people do have an inherent will to help each other, and the principle of mutual aid is very much about help flowing in multiple ways and it being removed from this concept of binaries of helper and helpee or well and unwell, and looking at how support flows constantly in, sound like a massive hippie, but in a like ecosystem in our community. So yeah, I think it's also worth saying that the volume of groups is a huge success, the number of groups that started, and the people that engaged. And I think again, there's a real dangerous conception of the kind of people who want to do community organising, who want to be involved in this kind of work, and the mutual aid groups smashed those false expectations, and there was a real mix of demographics that were engaging in these spaces. Something I'll come on to is maybe the roles different people took up is maybe less of a success in those groups, and the people who felt entitled to certain levels of power within groups that by principle shouldn't have hierarchies is something that's not a success. But I think we definitely saw cross-political collaboration to support communities in a way that I think lots of people wouldn't have thought was possible, and that's a real testament to like human nature and kindness that I think we shouldn't be afraid to talk about and to challenge divisiveness more. I think some of the most successful projects, and I think Juno will talk about this a bit more, were ones where they did actual resource redistribution and where capital from wealthier people in mutual aid groups was redistributed to people who needed it, especially when that was done with a no questions asked approach and like with trust in mind, as well as the Swarm Fund. There are a number of other funds included, one by the Classwork Project, which did that work really successfully, and I really recommend reading the reports of how that was done if you're interested in thinking about ways resource redistribution can be done successfully. And finally, I think the biggest success of the mutual aid groups, other than the acts happening, was the hope it generated. And I think that lockdown was a scary time for people, a real period of isolation, and knowing that these groups existed was a real lifeline for lots of people, and gave lots of other people a sense of purpose. As I said, there were some real challenges as well. The main one was the media perception of what we were as a group, who I was, as the like inventor of mutual aid, and which was just really not helpful, and a real need to like label some people as heroes and some people as victims, which completely undoes the principles of what mutual aid is and what it's for. And with that, I think embedded a sort of saviour complex into some of the people that were leading the groups. And, you know, that again, there wasn't, mutual aid is built on solidarity and not charity. And there was a real kind of charity model embedded into some of the mutual aid groups in a way that I think centralised power in a few people who thought they were the do-gooders doing the stuff for other people, rather than actually looking at what the radical principles of mutual aid are. Which, yeah, I think is like, again, it's not to say that that wasn't well intended, but I think it undid some of that. And I think that something that I think is not necessarily a challenge, but it is like an interesting reflection, and to think about how it's undone it is what, as I said earlier, mutual aid groups have existed traditionally in and for communities who can't access support or in traditional ways, and are forced to exist outside the traditional economy. And these new groups that swelled in number during the lockdown were majorly comprised of people who traditionally do thrive within that traditional economy and within state structures, and actually have a lot more respect and trust in the state. And in doing that, they replicated some of the power dynamics and ways of working and principles that in those groups that mean that the people who normally would exist in mutual aid groups to support each other were then being excluded from these new mutual aid groups. So that for me was a big problem, but also one that I had no idea how to choose. Like how do you dismantle white supremacy and, you know, talk about abolition via a Facebook group? It's really difficult. And again, there was a real need both in some of the mutual aid groups themselves, but also from external organisations and charities and kind of other organisations to want to centralise power and information sharing of all of the network of local groups, which definitely wasn't the intention of the platform that we set up. We just wanted to create a map where groups could find each other and share some resources that were best practice. And actually there was a real want from some organisations to like centralise knowledge sharing and centralise power, and who gets to hold the data of who's in all these groups, and also how do we use these groups for campaigning purposes. And it's like, that's not the point. That's literally not the point of mutual aid. That idea of centralised power is not compatible with the radical principles of mutual aid, and attempts to co-opt them by organisations with hierarchy was something that we had to constantly bat away. And also I think there's some burnout in key organisers that set up mutual aid groups for the first time and felt the need to work quickly. Again, there's a like inherent need in our society to feel like we have to get everything done quickly, and we know that this pandemic is in the long haul. And actually there were some people that I think through adrenaline, through fear, through genuine good intention, also burnt out from overexerting themselves. I think I'm at my time, so I'm just going to conclude with like 2 points, which, like, again, I think I'm really happy to answer questions about specific things. I'm trying to cover a lot in not a lot amount of time. But I think the 2 main takeaways that I would have from what I've learned as an organizer, and what I think other people can learn and take forward into the next lockdown, are the 2 things that we can look at are that, as I've said repeatedly, like fundamentally mutual aid exists because of the failings of the state and of NGOs and of welfare services to give people the actual support they need. So when those organisations and people within those structures are asking, oh, how can we get involved in mutual aid? How can we support it? I think a better question in some ways is like, how do we challenge what's happening in the structures of those organisations to exclude those people in the first place? And it's a much better question to say, okay, why is our economy excluding sex workers and migrants, rather than being like, how do I join a mutual aid group and embed the way I'm used to working, that then ends up excluding those people again. So doing some internal structural reflection and thinking about where privileges show up is really important. And the second thing is, I think there's often a really patronizing, racist, ableist, classist trope that communities need saving. And the history of mutual aid shows time and time again that communities do have the knowledge they need to form their own solutions, and they don't need empowering. Like, the idea that these people need empowering is ridiculous, because they've been surviving pandemics for their entire existence, and structural racism, structural classism, ableism, all of the things. And so the best thing that we can do as people who maybe don't exist within those communities, or exist in some of them but not others, is think about actually what does practical resource redistribution look like, and how it's not that they lack the solutions, it's that they often lack the financial capital to make stuff work. So what are the people who have access to that resources able to do to allow communities to support themselves and genuinely thrive? And hopefully Juno is going to talk a bit more about what good resource redistribution looks like in a little bit. Thanks for listening to me. Sorry I spoke quickly at the end.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Anna. I think that's really useful to have an overview of mutual aid during the pandemic, but within the context of mutual aid's much longer history and much wider purpose. And we're going to get to that in questions after the speakers. But if you have any questions now, do post them in the chat like people are doing, and we're going to get to them. Next, can we hear from Louise?
Hello, can you all hear me? I'm going to assume you can. Cool. Hi, thanks for inviting me to this event. I'm going to talk to you mostly about my work with and as part of mutual aid efforts which sprung up during the recent lockdown, and mostly about my experience in Bristol. It's worth noting that the term mutual aid has taken on a somewhat different meaning since lockdown for a lot of people. I think some of the groups I'll talk about are truly mutual aid, kind of purely, and some are more along the road to charitable organisations and other third sector businesses. However, as I'll tell you, these lines aren't as easy to draw as we often try to. I think the recent surge in mutual aid efforts has really highlighted for me how actually the spirit of mutual aid is still very much alive, even if it's not always theoretically pure. My experience with mutual aid efforts is largely focused on food provision. I'm a director of NFS Bristol and a former national organiser of the National NFS Network. National Food Service is a network of food justice organisations working together to build a new public service from the ground up. The vision is to have a national food service akin to the British restaurants shut down by Churchill, providing free and low-cost meals run by and for their local communities. NFS is explicitly rooted in mutual aid. We describe ourselves in those terms and aim to build locally rooted, mutually beneficial projects where the people in coordinating roles are from the same communities as the people who eat. We know that reducing the division between volunteer and recipient makes for better, more sustainable and more engaging projects. But that I'm even talking about people as recipient and volunteer tells you we aren't perfectly pure mutual aid in the way some people understand it. We are coordinated, we have lead coordinators, and some of these are paid. Most of our local branches are registered as CICs and receive grant funding from the big grant funding bodies. Our vision of a national food service is one that we all pay into with our time and our money, so that it's there for us and for everyone who uses it. That will be a system of mutual aid. To get there, we work in ways that aren't purely mutual on equal terms. We're not above playing the game. That's the debate that I'm going to keep coming back to. This term has been thrown around a lot, mutual aid, and I think it's really worth exploring. Bristol was a hotspot for mutual aid during the lockdown, in particular the BS5 postcode, which is an area dominated by South Asian families and anarchists, which are two groups who are already committed to mutual aid, both conceptually and practically. Bristol mutual aid groups were quickly set up, and lots developed a fairly straightforward structure with street level WhatsApp groups and wider network leads. I can't take credit for any of these. Apart from some safeguarding support, my work was pretty much with NFS Bristol. We, NFS Bristol, set one of the largest emergency food delivery services in the city from scratch. We delivered over 50,000 meals and still counting. From a relatively unknown organisation, we've become one of the biggest names in the food scene in the city. Lockdown for me has been by far one of the hardest things I've ever done, and I am now more tired than I have ever been. Our ability to provide as much as we did is hugely thanks to the collaborative efforts of all the other food justice organisations in the city and nationally. Before the lockdown, there was a fair amount of the usual left and third sector infighting. There was like, you know, your food project isn't doing things the right way, ours is how you should be doing things, blah, blah, blah. But once lockdown struck, all that kind of talk was thrown out. We all united against the common enemy. It became immediately obvious that the only way we had any chance in hell of feeding everyone was if all of us were running at full pelt. And the only way to do that was if we supported each other. I can't list all the organisations who we've worked with. I'll give an honourable mention to the Food Cycle volunteers who did their cycling collections for us, the Plough who shared their excess produce, and Food Union. I would like to give a shout out to Anya of Food Union specifically. I feel like the recent Vittles article was really unfair on her. Like, yeah, Food Union, for those of you aware, like markets itself as supporting restaurants to feed the front line, but they've actually used loads of this money to help organisations like ours. Funds brought in because the public are happy to fund pizza for nurses was used to feed the less marketable groups who really face the brunt of the COVID mismanagement. Food Union does some really good work, both for restaurant workers and for people in poverty. Anya has been a really great ally in this work. Without Food Union's cash, we'd have been down the 500 meals per week they funded Tali Cafe Eastern to make for us. These all halal meals were absolutely essential to us being able to feed people. This collaboration is, in my mind, another example of mutual aid. I felt like we were all shaken out of the spell of capitalist competition and could finally see the real picture. Only if each organisation helped each other would we achieve anything remotely useful. We weren't helping each other in order to gain something. Our interactions weren't mediated by a cash or credit system controlled by the state. It was, have these spuds because you need them and take this freezer because you need that, all in the knowledge that when we were in need, someone would provide for us, which they did. In Bristol, as in Sheffield, Hackney, and I'm sure in other cities and counties, there's been a huge amount of trust and collaboration, not only between community groups and charities, but from the council as well. Those 3 areas I know about because they're connected to NFS branches, but I'm sure it's true elsewhere. This COVID response has been absolutely based on unprecedented open collaboration and trust. Councils have been trusting anarchists. The rugby club, which lent us their kitchen for free, also hosted Base and Roses, which is an anarchist collective who have ACAB written on a banner over their space. In Sheffield, the NFS branch food hall was asked by the council to feed their most vulnerable people, and they distributed the food packages from the council. In Bristol, the council were referring people to us for food, as well as to Acorn for shopping and local mutual aid groups for advice. This effort felt like a real example of public commons partnerships. The council was turning to the local and specific knowledge of on-the-ground organisations to provide for the city. Which brings me to the other side of this wonderfully mutually cooperative spirit. The council put a lot of responsibility and work onto the shoulders of volunteers. Yes, we proved we could do it. Yes, we rose to the challenge. Yes, we started the project off our own backs because we believed it was right, but we had a level of work put onto our plates that we didn't consent to, and bar a couple of months of larger grant funds was unpaid. That's 6 months full-time work, most without weekends or breaks, for only 2 months pay for only 3 members of our organisation. And now what? I'm exhausted, physically and spiritually. I'm exhausted. I don't have it in me to repeat what I did over the last lockdown, nor does anyone I talk to in the food scene. I need to earn some money to pay my rent, and I need to rest. So what happens come the second lockdown, and who will fill the gap that we're leaving? The council doesn't have the resources, nor the skills and experience to recreate what we did. The larger voluntary projects are all burnt out. We gave all we had to help others, and now there's nothing left to help in return. Have we, by stepping up and filling the gap left by the austerity state, legitimised its violence? Mutual aid, as a term, is picked up and run with by thousands of people who have previously never heard the words. Larger groups like ours, already familiar with that kind of work, stepped up, but so did hundreds of smaller community groups. In Bristol and South Gloss, there were many small, well-run, independent food services. Some run literally from a tent in someone's front garden. These groups have no political agenda. They might shun party politics entirely. Many of them shun the term mutual aid completely because they're too organised for that. I've recently taken on a new paid job working for a local third sector organisation as a community developer. I'm supporting these small projects, whether they call themselves mutual aid or not. The third sector view of these efforts is pretty different from the left. They're a new community asset doing the work that we don't have the staff for. I'm charged with supporting and developing these groups so they can keep doing their voluntary work for as long as possible. In some cases, We know that support staff have stepped back from helping individuals they now know are being fed by their neighbours. Private and public support staff have taken this voluntary effort to save them cash. By helping these new community groups to grow, I'll be helping. Overall, we've seen a rise in mutual aid efforts over lockdown. It's been amazing. Organisations like NFS have stepped up to the challenge and proven ourselves. We provided unimaginable amounts of food and support for people. But the groups which lead with the most hope and the firmest evidence that mutual aid and solidarity are alive and well aren't the big groups like ours or the collaboration with allies like Food Union, nor the fantastic efforts of anarchists. It's the same people as always. It's working class women working themselves to the bone, just like always. It's working class women turning their living rooms, their kitchens, and their front lawns into food banks. We used to call this solidarity. Now it's called apolitical, charity, or community work, or nothing really. Just as neighbours pulling together what we can because we've all been there at one time or another. But this is mutual aid in every sense of the word, and it's as strong in the face of state violence as it's always been. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Louise. Yeah, it's really good to hear an allusion there to the difference between how the third sector and how the left views mutual aid. And perhaps we can come back to some of the contradictions in using that term in the breakout groups. Our final speaker is Juno Mac, before we're going to go to those questions. So Juno, take it away.
Hi. Yeah, really great contributions there from Anna and Louise. I really appreciate how they both took the time to explore what has gone well recently, but also some of the tensions it brings up, the challenges of practicing mutual aid, and also the more abstract ethical considerations. I think I definitely resonated with that thing about sometimes when the shit hits the fan and we're all working very hard and there's a sense of panic and the idea that time is of the essence. I think it's really impressive to even have a minute to stop and think about the bigger picture when you're in emergency mode. So yeah, I appreciated some of those questions raised. Hopefully we can discuss them more later on in this event. But for people who don't know about the organization that I work with, Swarm, prior to the pandemic, we were founded and have been run by sex workers as a peer-led group since 2009. We were formerly known as the Sex Worker Open University, and we've always sought to improve our working conditions by fighting for our rights and raising awareness both inside and outside of our movement of the links between the conditions of sex workers in the UK and austerity and criminalisation. When the pandemic happened in March, we decided to create a hardship fund to help people who've been left without income. Sex workers' income was generally decimated about 2 or 3 weeks ahead of the lockdown. And prior to that, we'd been running or promoting individual fundraisers for people when they were in need, but we realized that sort of communizing these efforts would be a fairer way to make sure everyone was getting their needs met without having to rely on, a popularity contest. But when the pandemic happened, that really expedited our thinking on that. It was a nascent idea that we had to put into action as soon as possible. We decided that we'd create 3 criteria for applications to the fund. An applicant would have to be making their living by doing in-person sex work in the UK. So whether that's selling sex in brothels on the street or in private, or pro-BDSM work, stripping, any form of sex work that was rendered completely incapacitated basically by the pandemic. The second criteria was to be in or at imminent risk of severe financial hardship in the coming weeks. And third, to have no savings to fall back on. And we decided, crucially, to make the hardship fund an honesty-based system, meaning that if people self-identified themselves as meeting those 3 bits of criteria, then that was all that was needed. We weren't going to do any further investigation. We weren't going to make people jump through hoops. We were going to trust what people said about their own situation. And in some ways, this was an easier call to make because just being a sex worker probably meant people didn't have any work at the time. So we decided to give people grants of £200 each. We verified the fact that they were sex workers with either a phone call conversation or by having them send us a link to their online working tools or their adverts or their profiles. We managed to raise £251,000, thanks in part to match funding, but also lots of private donations from people. Various other movements ran fundraisers for us. We had a video that we were promoting, so people really rallied together. We hit a patch of significant donor fatigue a couple of months in, and it took us about 3 months to give away all the money in £200 donations, in £200 payments to about 1,300 people. We only paid people once. We weren't able to make subsequent payments. And if anyone's interested to read more in detail about exactly how we did the fund, I won't take up more of my time today explaining it, but we did write a report. I'm just going to post a link to it in the chat right now. It's on our blog on the Swarm site, explaining how we ran it and some of the challenges that we came up against. I think in terms of thinking about the situation for sex workers and why we felt it was really important to take this action, money always has been key to understanding harms against sex workers. Money or lack of access to money, economic hardships, is the door by which harms can enter a sex worker's life. For example, impeding a sex worker's ability to escape domestic violence, or whether they're in an exploitative relationship with a manager or a partner, or they're struggling to negotiate with a client. Less money means less power generally, which is why the mutual aid that sex workers have been doing around the world, not just us in the UK, but all around the world, has been focused at the moment on direct redistribution of money, or otherwise helping to remove barriers to accessing more money. So another thing we did was run a workshop on how to apply for universal credit and support people through that process, or other things that can pose economic barriers, like making sure sex workers have access to a mobile phone that they can use for work. I also just posted a link in the chat to another project someone in Swarm is running, where they arranged for sex workers to receive a free phone. So please check that out if you have phones that you've got lying around. I think a reason why mutual aid for sex workers is so radical is because that sex workers, like a lot of marginalized groups, a key part of the stigma that follows sex workers around is the idea that they are work shy, feckless, too lazy to have real jobs, and ultimately not able to really make sensible decisions for themselves. The idea that their strategies for survival are somehow flawed or pathological, and ultimately that they're not responsible enough to be given more significant help than just endless meetings with job advisors. By giving money directly to sex workers and crucially not expecting them to go through really stringent selection processes, we were basically saying that for us, like the honesty-based system says that we think sex workers are able to make decisions in their own lives. And as well as the money, I think it was really important for applicants to the fund to feel that other sex workers who are helping them access this money, there's a fundamental reciprocity there, in the sense that all sex workers receiving help within the sex worker movement also avail themselves of that help at some point. It's, you know, as the other speaker said, based on ideas of solidarity, horizontal organizing, and understanding about situations. I think it meant a lot to the applicants, many of whom I spoke to directly on the phone, the idea that in explaining their need for this money, they didn't have to contend with ideas about their brokenness, their pathological behavior, which is unfortunately something they were really familiar with through dealing with the benefit system and other interactions with the state or the third sector. The idea that there's something wrong with them and that their approach has to be coached in the terms of an apology or a redemption, which obviously in the sex worker movement, we're used to not thinking in those terms about the work that we do. For me, mutual aid is inherently political, although I can easily understand why people at this time are trying to do the work and push past ideas of conversations about how political it is. As sex workers, we're not just trying to meet the needs that have been, the resources that have been destroyed, but we also seek to understand like why those resources aren't there in the first place, and centering the experiences of people who are facing crises on day one, on day zero. The impetus to get the hardship fund off the ground for many of the organisers in Swarm came from the sense that we also didn't have any work, and I think that fundamentally shaped the trajectory of how we ran the fund. I think that, as Anna mentioned, sustainability and burnout is really key to consider. The hardship fund posed so many difficult questions emotionally, mainly just feeling like we couldn't possibly really contend with the wider issues that were leading people to make applications. £200 once is not enough to sustain somebody for more than a week or two max. Especially some of the people we were speaking to on the phone had families to support, people who didn't know that they were selling sex in the first place. And so they didn't only have to contend with suddenly having no money, but also having to explain not being able to suddenly have any money to people who didn't understand their situation. I also think radical movements, definitely need to be aware of the way that the term mutual aid can be co-opted and depoliticized, cut away from its roots, which is very much tied up with Black and brown working class communities. I think as the term becomes more useful to power and authority, it's at risk of being appropriated, and it's vulnerable to being seen as a replacement for state welfare provision, as Louise mentioned. When we were running the hardship fund, we actually saw an example of this with the police. We heard this via people making applications to the fund, and when we spoke to them on the phone, they said they'd learned about the fund from being approached by police officers while they were working outdoors, and the police were telling them to leave and go home and apply to the hardship fund instead. And obviously it was good that they heard about the hardship fund, but there was this sense from these applicants that they felt the police had overpromised to them, that said that they could get multiple payments. And also this idea that the police are kind of relying on the mutual aid fund as a way to reassure people that you need to go home now, get off the street. So kind of, leaning on the existence of the fund instead of, seeing themselves as a big part of the problem there. I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully, if people are interested, they can check out the report. My Twitter is Juno Mac _ as well, if people want to see some more stuff about how we ran the hardship fund. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Juno. Right, I think we've got about 20 minutes, just under, for questions. And then about 1:10, we'll have a little break and then go into the breakout rooms. There's some questions in the chat already. If you'd like to ask a question in person, do put a dot in the chat and I'll come to you. We probably won't have time to come to everyone, so I do ask that questions are questions and not comments. If you've got comments, save them for the breakout room, because there'll be time to go into stuff kind of in detail in smaller groups. Let's go to a question from earlier. I think that was one from I can't remember who this was from, but it's for Anna, and it's, is there a class dimension to mutual aid as it developed on your map?
Hiya. I don't fully understand the question, but I can try and answer it, or if the person who asked the question wants to rephrase it, maybe, but I can try and answer it what I think you're asking, and then okay, I'm just gonna go for it. I mean, I think there's definitely a class dimension to mutual aid in that, as I said, a lot of mutual aid's history is in not just working class communities, but lower working class communities and like people living in poverty. And I think there's an important, like, I think definitions around class are confusing to everyone, but I think it's important to think about, like, specifically lower working class communities with experiences of poverty and the history of mutual aid in those spaces. And again, where the state has rejected those people as disposable or only seen as like temporary disposable workers rather than actual full humans that have things to contribute to society. And yeah, I think in terms of what I would say is on that, what we saw was a much wider engagement across a class spectrum of people that were taking up roles in mutual aid groups, starting mutual aid groups, not obviously partially because mutual aid groups were happening all across the country in different streets with different class demographics. I think one of the things that I noticed as a challenge was the people who felt most entitled to take up leadership roles in mutual aid groups, which in itself is a false thing, that there shouldn't be leadership roles in mutual aid groups, but were often from more middle class backgrounds and with other privileges as well around gender, around, like, you know, English as a first language. So yeah, that's for me where the issues around class were showing up on the map in that way. But yeah, I think it's important to recognise the history of mutual aid as deeply rooted in lower working class communities. Hope that answered your question. If not, maybe we can. Yeah.
Maybe Nick can come back. I think it was Nick who asked the question in the chat. But in the meantime, does anyone else want to come in on that? No? That's fine. And Nick says it answers his question, so that's great. Right. We've got a question from Catherine, which I think is addressed to anyone who wants to answer it, which is, how do we stop mutual aid being used as a replacement, justification even, for cutting state services? Many disabled people lost all support during COVID and had to rely on voluntary groups or family members, and now fear that because they have survived, councils may not need to reinstate the support. Louise, do you want to come in first on that, maybe?
Hi, yeah. This is a huge fear of mine personally, and I'm sure of loads of people. I do see it happening. I know of a few cases where we know this has happened. At the moment, as we're winding down the NFS Bristol Food Delivery Project, we're trying to track down the organisations that were supporting some individuals before and try and get them to start that up again, because otherwise once we stop delivering, people won't have anything. However, we're equally facing the fact that a lot of people just didn't have support before, and so it's not that someone's gone, it's that they just lived off snacks or nothing before, and now, you know, they'll go back to that, which is really kind of hard to live with. But yeah, I think the only way we can combat that is by, you know, campaigning, by collective action, by making statements about it. I also know that the more coordinated mutual aid groups and organisations such as NFS can do a lot with data. We're currently trying to produce a report on, you know, we've surveyed our recipients, and we're trying to produce a report on describing the nature of the need we found in the city, like the areas most affected, the sort of comments and explanations for why people have been ordering from us that we get. And we can then present this to the council. We say, look, this is the need we've identified, and this is what we know you need to do something about. I think, you know, often these groups kind of struggle to collect data, or they're like, oh, you know, they don't have the skills, or they don't understand the purpose of it. But I think actually, if we can get some hard numbers from this, I think we'll have a very strong case.
Thanks so much. Moving on to a question from Dora for Juno, I think. It's a long question, it's got many parts, so I'm just going to pick out one, and then Dora, if you think I've picked the worst bit, you can say it in the chat and maybe you can come in. What has been the support being offered by the mainstream trade union movement and broader labour movement to sex workers? she also asks, is bogus self-employment and zero-hour contracts the norm? And under whose agency has a safe return to work been safeguarded? So there's 3 bits there, but pick any one.
Yeah, I was just reading the full question, and it, you know, Dora also asked about other kind of, basically listed almost the entire demands of the UK sex worker rights movement. You know, there's been very little support, especially during the pandemic. We do have some support from the trade union movement, and sex workers are even organising in their own unions at the moment, particularly strippers. In United Voices of the World, organising for better working conditions. But as far as safe return to work for sex workers, emergency housing for sex workers, financial support, worker status, sick pay, wage loss relief, these are all things that sex workers were already demanding and not getting before the pandemic. To the extent that sex workers are receiving that kind of help, it's the same as the rest of working class population in the UK. It's not easy. So people were reporting spending 8 hours on hold with universal credit. When we spoke to them on the phone, a lot of people were availing themselves of other kinds of mutual aid, not just the mutual aid project that we were running. And a safe return to work for sex workers is just as dangerous and risky as it's always been, with an extra added amount of risk at the moment. So also, to address the previous question, which I think was super interesting, about how can we make sure that mutual aid isn't plugging a gap only then to reveal more of a void. I think the point that Louise made about addressing the fact that some people have always been living with this kind of lack, and something that I think is really needed to try to move on from where we're at now is cultivating in people like that, sex workers and other people who've always gone without, is a sense of entitlement and anger that is very difficult to cultivate in people when they don't see themselves as being entitled to a certain thing. Like a lot of the applicants to our hardship fund don't see themselves as workers, and with that comes a lack of entitlement to workers' rights. And so the idea of a lot of the things in Dora's question is anathema to the way a lot of sex workers see themselves. They might not even use the term sex worker. So I think it's really about trying to cultivate some rage and some political perspectives in people so that they can form part of a movement and ultimately get unionized. But prior to that, there's just a sense that they were, people felt like they were lucky to get this £200 handout once, and it's just completely insufficient. So yeah, thanks for those questions.
Thanks, Juno. Yeah, I think that's a really salient point about mutual aid in some cases not being a replacement for anything, because there was nothing to begin with. Right, we're going to go to the breakout in a second. I did want to say, before we move on to the next question, that there is a forum for this event that I will put in the chat soon, and all the kind of resources that are collected in this chat, the links that have been posted, will be posted there as well and be available for posterity, because not everyone would have saved it from this chat, I'm sure. And I think one of the last questions we'll go to is another one from Nick, and applicable to all of you, which is how do leaders emerge or appoint themselves? He's fascinated by that. What were your guidelines about leadership power and horizontalism? Was there an element of political education to your work, which is, I think it's a separate question rather than connected, maybe. So anyone who wants to speak on that.
I can start if that's useful. So I think it's an interesting question about what were our guidelines versus the fact that we were trying to not centrally tell all the groups how to function, because again, that in itself, we wanted the groups to function in the way that best worked for them. But within that, there was definitely traditional tropes of the same kinds of people taking up leadership roles, which, as I've said, ideally leadership roles wouldn't exist. And we did try and circulate some resources about how to do more horizontal facilitation and trying to decentralize power. Especially one of the main things that we noticed was groups who felt like they needed to cover their whole postcode area or their whole town or their whole like borough of London. And it was like, no, the most effective groups are the ones that are working in small areas, like street by street, collaborating in that way, and actually genuinely building a sense of community where the flows of help, the flow of support, of energy generally is felt more equally and isn't this binary transaction. Or as I said before, when it's specific demographics working in community groups. So yeah, I think that the political education was basically trying to get rid of the hierarchies of power that exist within traditional charity structures and move more towards solidarity principles and collective community care. But again, I don't know how trying to do that at the same time as also wanting the groups to exist autonomously and set up their own frameworks for how they operate. It was a really tricky balance, and I'm not sure, I don't think we did it perfectly. I think there have been a lot of power struggles in mutual aid groups, a lot of self-appointed, dominating forces in some of those spaces. But I do think there has been some positive shift in terms of how people have cooperated with each other and challenged the idea of how charity/solidarity is works and what the differences are. And I think an understanding that there is a difference is something that we can hopefully continue to push.
Awesome, thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on this question of leadership, maybe?
I speak briefly. So yeah, I'd say I have the same experiences that the people that took leadership positions across different kinds of mutual aid groups were usually the same sort of people. Generally, well, I don't know, in Bristol at least, mutual aid groups were quite, I don't know, like separate racially, if you know what I mean? Like there was a really strong existing networks of Muslim faith groups that already communicate with one another, always did a lot of mutual aid groups, and they just continued and stepped up with the same leaders they had before. And then white people, I guess, a lot of them formed new mutual aid groups that hadn't previously existed because they weren't doing that work before, a lot of them. In NFS, because we grew very quickly, most of our coordinators were furloughed people with quite a lot of professional experience, which I think really helped. In the community groups I'm now working with across South Gloss, which is a non-metropolitan area, so it's not a city, it's like many small towns around Bristol. I'd say it's predominantly working class white women who have taken leadership roles, and they are prepared to argue for resources, sometimes argue with me, sometimes argue when I'm trying to help them. But it's these, same bullshit people that are always doing this, and they're taking the same leadership positions. I will give a brief shout out to the safeguarding support that I ran with the help of COVID Mutual Aid at the start of lockdown. A big part of what I wanted to get across, and that I hope I got across, is that it's important to recognise that even, if not especially in a group without a formal hierarchy, there will be informal power structures that you still need to safeguard against and safeguard around. I recommend everyone read The Tyranny of Structurelessness, as I always do. Without structure, you sometimes allow people to take power without a way to combat it. So I actually think the groups that have a bit more structure tended to fare better in those terms.
Juno, is that something you'd agree with?
Yeah, I think, with the work that Swarm is doing, it's more centralized with a very small team. We talk about it in the report that I sent a link to, but there was about 10 of us working on the hardship fund. So we kind of adopted the same kind of structure that we do within Swarm, which is non-hierarchical, but with a steering element. But I think, yeah, the other two made probably more enlightening points that I'll be able to make on this one, because sex worker organizing has generally quite small and intimate, and we try and, you know, we struggle with the power thing because of the like huge variation in capacity that people have. It tends to be people who can do a bit more, and we try and just stay regulated. But I'm very interested in the book actually that Louise just mentioned, because I think it's really important for any grassroots movement to think about that kind of stuff.
Sweet, thank you. We haven't got too much time now, and there's a bunch of chat about wanting to find more resources, and that article can be posted in the chat and in the forum as well. I'll get on that. So now how it's going to work is we're going to have a 5-minute break, because you guys have been looking at the screen for an hour now, which is not good, even though we do it all the time. And then when we come back, there'll be a breakout group of about half an hour where you'll talk to people about mutual aid. And each group is going to have a different question to consider. And I encourage you to kind of pick the group that you think you could contribute to and learn from. And you can do that by just putting a number in the chat box. The groups will be posted on here in the chat, so you can read them, but I'll just read them out really quickly. The first one is, how do I start a mutual aid group? The second one is, how do we resist burnout? The third one is, how do we build radical mutual aid? Which is going to ask questions including, have the forms of mutual aid seen during the COVID-19 pandemic been radical enough? And whatever that means. And the fourth one is going to be, how have the dynamics of mutual aid been shifting? So that's about how methods changed during the pandemic, and how government measures affect mutual aid work. So there's these 4 groups. There's half an hour to talk about them. Have a think in the 5-minute break about which group you would find most useful and that you could contribute to, and just put a number in the chat. And if you don't do that, you'll be randomly assigned. And for now, just go away for 5 minutes. See you then.
View the full TWT20 program and become a supporter today to help us deliver political education all year round at theworldtransformed.org.